Hi everyone and good morning. Welcome to the first session of knowledge management course. Remember that this is not a lecture, this is just an introduction to the first session. In this session, we will cover three important questions. First, what is knowledge? Especially from the organizational perspective. Why organizations actually need to care about knowledge is the second one, and the third question is how do organizations manage knowledge? Related to the first question, basically there are a few definitions that you can spot in the readings, Davenport chapter 1 especially, and Lamb 2000 paper. Check out them and see how knowledge is differently defined. If you look at Davenport chapter 1, the authors give a few examples of knowledge on the daily basis. You can also start thinking about your own work and life experience. In which occasions, in which forms you encounter the examples of knowledge. It's also interesting to reflect on the things that are not knowledge but may be mistakenly considered as knowledge. There are a few examples in the book, chapters, and also in other sources you can find, for instance, data, information, action, symbols, culture. They are not knowledge. They are somehow related, but they are not actually knowledge. And what is important about the first question is to consider different forms of knowledge. So knowledge has different forms. It appears in different ways, and sometimes it's considered as the dimensions of knowledge. Two important distinctions are made in both the book chapters and the paper. The first one is between the tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge. And if you read through these readings, you will spot the differences between the two and the different examples. The knowledge that is difficult to articulate, to codify, is called tacit, and the knowledge that is easier to be discussed, to be shared, to be codified is called explicit knowledge. The second distinction is made between individual and collective knowledge. The knowledge that an individual expert has versus the knowledge that a whole team, for instance, an agile developing team has. And if you cross these two, you will get a nice 2x2 matrix, which is described in Lamb paper, and that offers you the four types of knowledge, or the four forms of knowledge inside the organizations. These are not the only two dimensions that you can consider for the distinctions between the knowledge forms. There are many other dimensions. A question that I suggest to you at this point is that when you list examples of knowledge, either from your own experience or from the readings, start asking, how can you actually compare them? And what are the differences between these examples? Some of them might be more, for instance, valuable than the others. Some of them might be more spread in the organization than the others. So there are a lot of dimensions on which we can consider the differences between the knowledge forms. So make sure that you cover the two readings, having in mind this general question that what is knowledge from an organizational perspective. And if you do a good job, you probably come up with a list of characteristics of knowledge. So any kind of knowledge within the organizations that we talk about shares more or less these characteristics. So I don't explain all of them one by one. I just quickly touch on these characteristics. So knowledge is context dependent. It depends on the situation. Knowledge is related to practice. It's difficult to think about knowledge without connecting to an action or a practice. When we talk about knowledge, one way or another, human aspects, human dimensions come into the play. Knowledge has a tacit dimension, so it's difficult to envision purely explicit forms of knowledge. Knowledge accumulates over time, so it's like a pool of water that the more you add to, the more knowledge is accumulated. Knowledge is holistic in the sense that one part of knowledge becomes meaningful and effective when it is connected to the other parts. If you think about the experience of a doctor, knowing about the organs and their positions becomes valuable when this person combines it with the knowledge of the medicines and the drugs and the treatments. Knowledge can be reused. If I know something and in a way you also learn that, you still can use it without preventing me from actually effectively using this knowledge. And at the end, knowledge is like the fruit that has expiration date. Any food you get has an expiration date. The same goes for knowledge in the organization. So knowledge expires more or less at a certain time. So, the second question that is important when you go through the readings for the session 1 is to ask yourself why knowledge is important for the organizations. If you start from Davenport chapter 1, which I absolutely recommend to start with, you see different reasons that the two authors talk about the importance of knowledge for the organizations. The same if you consider the paper by Al-Islam. She also talks about why knowledge is important at the beginning of the paper. And just to add a little bit to these two readings, there has been a historical analysis of the question how organizations create value. What inputs help organizations create value? And there, people actually measured the role of labor, basically the employees, the number of employees that you have in the organizations, and the resources, capital, money, land, let's say buildings, equipments. And when they measured the role of these two factors for creating value for the organizations, they realized that these two factors together explain less than 50% of the value that organizations produce. And this is a study that has been done in late 80s by Solow, one of the economists. And the question was that what is the residual? What is the remaining part? What is the other more than 50%? And over years, researchers discovered that this bigger part comes from knowledge and other intellectual resources, such as brand, social capital. Among all, knowledge is a big part. So, this is basically to highlight the fact that knowledge is important for organizations because this is one of the key assets that they have. That's the same argument that you see in Davenport's book. There are a few other reasons that makes knowledge particularly or especially important. Some people argue that knowledge can generate more value than any other assets, just the study that I explained to you. You can buy other resources, other assets in the market, but you can't easily buy knowledge from the market. Imagine that a company wants to have a manager like Bill Gates. How easy is to buy such a person ready in the market? This is an argument that seems contradictory to what Davenport talks about in chapter 2. So see how you can reconcile this contradiction here. Knowledge is scarce, especially competitive knowledge, the knowledge that is valuable. And this is an argument that Al-Islam highly relies on that. See in which way you can find this support in her paper. And the production of the knowledge doesn't happen over time. It takes time. So because of all these reasons, organizations need to care about knowledge very seriously. And then we get to the third question, which is, if knowledge is so important, how do organizations manage knowledge? Again, I'm sure you read through the book chapters and also the paper, and when you check out, you see there are different answers given to this question. And throughout the course, we will get back to this question in different forms. I would like to highlight the two main approaches here. The first one, some people focus on the outside perspective of this question. Basically, if you ask Davenport and Prusok, particularly chapter 2, how organizations make sure that they have the knowledge that they need, the answer is that they trade it in the market. And in order to do that, they make sure that there are different roles, such as buyers, sellers, brokers. Different mechanisms are in place: pricing mechanism, signaling mechanism, motivation mechanisms. So make sure that you deeply read this part of the book and understand these mechanisms. However, they agree that market has some limitations in offering the knowledge that organizations need. They call it pathologies of knowledge market perspective. And then comes to a second perspective that the paper by Al-Islam tries to highlight. Her perspective is on alignment. She suggests that organizations try to manage, or in a better way, organize better for knowledge management by aligning their organizational structure, organizational forms with their environments. If they are living within, let's say, a very individual labor market in which the knowledge is highly standard, they try to get a form that is aligned with this way of managing and appropriating knowledge. And there are other ways. So if you look at the paper, you see that there is an interesting taxonomy that links the different forms of knowledge to different forms of organizations and then to the different structures or frameworks in the environment. But this is just the outside perspective. If you think about the way organizations manage their knowledge inside their organizations, then we need to think about the process perspective of knowledge management. This is the perspective that we build on in the coming sessions. As you see, it has a series of processes or sub-processes. Knowledge needs to be assessed and strategically thought about. The knowledge that is needed needs to be created within the organizations. It needs to be codified and coordinated, shared and transferred from one part to another part. Knowledge needs to be put in practice, be applied, be used. And at the end, the knowledge that is expired, that is not anymore useful or valuable, should be unlearned. And of course, these processes interact. And if you put them into a more systematic and dynamic perspective, you see that these basically have a dynamic system. That at the center is the knowledge base of the organization. And different flows of knowledge, try to fill in this knowledge base. So, just to summarize, make sure when you read the readings, you pay attention to the fact that how knowledge is a combination of understanding and skills, both tacit and explicit. Pay attention to the different forms of knowledge, and remember that this is a dynamic system of different processes when it comes to managing organizational knowledge. And these processes need to be properly aligned and in place. What can you do next that I recommend to you at the end of this short introductory slides? First, remember that this slide and this short audio is not a replacement of the readings. Make sure that you carefully read the first chapters of Davenport and Al-Islam. The book you need to prepare for yourself, and the paper is already uploaded on the Canvas. When you read, take notes of the important aspects and use the slides, the questions that I just suggested to you during the slides, as a guide of your reading, what you need to pay attention to. Of course, you may have a few questions about the concepts that are not clear or the things that you are not sure about. Any question about session 1 and session 2, ask them on the discussion board on their modules week 1. And there we also have some interactive activities, Q&A questions. Make sure that you check this page frequently and participate. And at the end, with session 2 that comes tomorrow, you have all the 2 sessions that you need to cover for the first quiz or exam. That will be next week on Monday. Wish you the best and keep in touch.